Yes, Mum. I'm just about to load up the video of Grandma Remembers from Croak's visit to Russia. And I'm just aware that some of the times it comes across a bit like a list because it's taken from Croak's diaries. And it may seem a little bit dry at times. But I think it's also the kind of side of Grandma which was the historian, because she's definitely putting her stamp on it, the context of the time. But I hope it makes sense, and I hope it's not too dry for you. Okay, well, I will put this little bit I've just recorded in front of it to put it into context. Okay, lots of love. Speak soon. Bye. Hello again, Mum. Another chapter from Grandma Remembers. This one is chapter 11, Croak's visit to Russia. Hope you're sitting comfortably. I am. Here we go. On September 28th of December 1912, at 8:15 in the morning, Croak's train pulled slowly into the St Petersburg station and came to a stop without a jerk. She had travelled about 1,000 miles since saying goodbye to great-grandfather Wild and Grandma, a little girl of 8, on the station platform in Berlin. In her notes, she describes her arrival in the capital thus. It was not as cold as I had expected, and there was not much snow on the ground. The hotel bus took Dr. Allen's little party through the wide streets between the low buildings of uniform height, giving the appearance of an American western town. And though the vast open squares to the Hotel de France, St. Petersburg, there we go, got that wrong. The vast open squares to the Hotel de France. St. Petersburg is built on piles, and some of the buildings are said to be sinking. That's like Belfast, isn't it? Certainly Venice. This impression of the spaciousness of a country town was, apparently, the one made generally on visitors, as is indicated by G. Dobson in his book Russia, published in the year of Croak's visit. As regards the sinking, we who experienced the same kind of thing in Belfast cannot doubt that was so. Built in the estuary, of the River Neva, as is Belfast on that of the Lagan, it did not find a firm footing on more solid ground on its periphery as Belfast, since all around was nothing but swamps and marshes. Balakirev, Peter, the great court jester, described the position of this new capital as on one side of the sea, on the other sorrow, on the third moss, on the fourth a sigh. During construction, the city was, from time to time, almost washed away, and during Peter's reign, there was about 7 serious inundations. I think a lot of people died too, from horrible diseases and things. At one of the parties, the guests escaped from the rising flood by wading ankle deep in the water through the palace rooms. Indeed, the founding of the new capital in this awkward position, so far away from Moscow, which had hitherto been the heart of Russia, was a wild and imaginative undertaking on the part of Peter the Great, executed by him with brilliance and ruthless speed, made possible by slave labour. Yeah, that thing. The Russian writer, Nerashikin, where are you, Claire, said, "A state with its capital at one of its extremities is like an animal with its heart on one of its toes." Very clever. All Russians hated St. Petersburg from the start, and went there only under compulsion by the Tsar, who was determined to westernize his subjects by forcing them to live and dress in Western style in houses designed by Western architects, since Russians had little experience of building with anything but wood or brick. At one time he obliged every person entering the city to bring with him a certain quantity of stone. From the ends of Russia they were driven in, including Tartars and Kalmucks, and many died like flies from the unhealthy conditions. This reluctance to live in the swamps of the northwest had persisted to the present day, and Moscow has never ceased to be regarded as the cradle, as in truth it was, with the heart of Mother Russia. As late as 1909, 3 years before Croak's visit, Dobson describes the unhealthy nature of the city. Croak was a member of a small party of Americans, hardly more than 10 or 12, visiting Russia under the guidance of Dr. T. Allen of, I think, the American University Travel Bureau, and his wife. The Allens knew Russia well, and Dr. Allen from time to time gave the group lectures on the sights they were seeing. A friend of Mrs. Allen's in St. Petersburg was a Madame Tarnke. She's described a charming Englishwoman who had married a Russian and had lived in Russia for 30 years. It was Madame Tanke who, after breakfast on that first day, took us through the Winter Palace, more homelike than many, the private apartments, Alexander II's apartments, no image on pillow, the Hermitage, built by Catherine II and used now for visiting royalty, the Royal Chapel, all stand, 3 bars for czars, Holy of Holies, crucifix, candelabras and tabernacle, painting on wall behind altar, blessing of waters and opening of rivers, reception room, champagne fountains, tables with odd numbers, arbour for tsarina and royal visitors, plates and salt cellars. I guess this was a kind of list written in note form. So later in the day, drove across the river to fortress, inside which is political prison. Also Church of St Peter and St Paul, mausoleum for czars and wives, plain white marble. Princes and dukes, etc., are being removed to new connecting mausoleum. Tomb of Peter the Great and wife and daughter, Catherine II, Alexander II, etc. Drove to St Peter's hut on low ground on same side of the river. Service going on in one room, beautiful singing, beggars, illuminated figure of Christ behind Holy of Holies, columns of malachite and lapis lazuli. Madonna and Child to left, sarcophagus, middle floor, on Good Friday, disappears over Easter, the Lord is risen, kissing, etc. And these notes end with, went to the People's Theatre in the evening, Tchaikovsky's opera, The Queen of Spades, Central Hall, theatre, top gallery, free kitchen, free feeding, etc. In her notes for the second day, Sunday 29th Croak writes, Tchaikovsky's opera, A Life for the Tsar, at the People's Theatre from 12:30 until 4 o'clock, at the Imperial Opera House for the ballet from 8 p.m. until 1 in the morning. Wow. Jewels, flowers, presents, etc. And to great-grandfather, she writes on the 30th, we went to the ballet last evening, so I slept until 10:30 this morning. It was a marvellous thing, and the most splendid audience I ever saw. Such beautiful women and handsome men, such gowns and jewels beyond price, and yet all quiet and in good taste. Monday, December the 30th, by Drosky, 2.5-mile drive to monastery of Alexander Nevsky, where the Metropolitan lives. Only a few weeks ago, the old man died in his 93rd year and was buried, like his predecessors, among the people. The new Metropolitan must always wash the feet of 12 priests. So I guess that's the bishop we're talking about. So there's Nevsky Square and other things named after him, aren't there? Prince Alexander of Novgorod had been canonized as Saint Alexander Nevsky, or Saint Alexander of the Neva, for having, in the mid-13th century, saved Russia from invasion by a holy crusade of the Roman Catholic Church, blessed by Pope Gregory X to convert the heathen Christians of the Orthodox Church. This expedition, quite international in composition, included many Swedes, Norwegians and Finns, and had a Swedish leader. The Crusaders sailed up the Neva to a point a few miles above the site where St Petersburg was to stand, expecting to overwhelm the Russians before the latter had time to muster. But Prince Alexander, with great speed and secrecy, gathered an army, fell upon the unwary Crusaders and cut them to bits. The Tsar, Peter I, had made this man the patron saint of his new capital and had founded the monastery in his memory. Croak's account continues. Tombs in the church, jewels in images, no guard. Cathedral, Holy of Holies again, exposed for us, and transparent glass oval of Christ over the altar. Van Dyck's Annunciation behind altar, Rubens' Descent from the Cross, outdoor graveyard. Rubinstein's and Tchaikovsky's tombs. Apart from St. Peter's in Rome, and perhaps not even there, I've never seen such magnificence as in these Russian churches. Bronze, gold, silver, diamonds, and all precious stones in such profusion. Priceless treasures, but none under guard. It's wonderful. The priests in all the churches we visited were remarkably courteous, going to great trouble to show us everything. They wear long hair and beards. This afternoon, among other things, she writes to great-grandfather, we saw some babies baptized in the church of St. Saviour's. They were less than 24 hours old. On each one the priest marked the forehead, hands and feet with a cross in oil. Then he blessed the water in the font and completely immersed each child, face downward, 3 times, placing the fingers of one hand over the ears, eyes, nose and mouth so deftly that the babies apparently took in no water. I wish Janet could have seen it. Tea at Madame Tarnquet's. Tea is drunk at all times and in all places, usually with lemons, but sometimes with milk. It's always very hot. A Russian proverb says, the mightiest gods in Russia are chin, rank, chai, tea, and shitsi, cabbage soup. Ooh, they're the top 3 there. Everyone is so cordial and, like the priests, anxious that we should see as much as possible. It began to snow hard, so we were hoping to see sledges next day. On New Year's Eve, the 18th of December, by the Russian calendar, we saw so many wonderful things that my head fairly reels with them. We started with a visit to the royal carriage horses and stables, where we saw the coronation carriage with ruby and diamond fringe inside, diamond monograms, diamonds in the hubs, etc. There were royal sledges as well, including Catherine's carnival sledge. Saddles, cloths, trappings, and were embroidered in pearls and precious stones. We saw the robes worn by heralds who announced the Tsar's death, and the royal tent of camel hair with glass window at the top and lined with marvellous embroideries. Catherine's tent was also lined with richly embroidered cloths and had a window of lattice work in ropes and curtain with a curtain behind. We saw the Tsars and Tsarinas and the princes and princesses' saddle horses, which are Spanish and pure white with pink eyes. In a letter to great-grandfather that same day, she wrote, tell Janet, I have been to the royal stables to see the riding horses. Almost all horses here have long, beautiful tails, almost touching the ground. And Croak's notes continue. Next we went to the Hermitage Museum to see the royal jewels, watches and fobs set with marvellous rubies, diamonds, emeralds and all other precious stones, diamond set mirrors and toilet articles, clocks, ornaments, miniatures, vases, snuff boxes, etc., etc. Such magnificence. We saw quantities of gems, many of huge size. We saw the gold toilet set used in dressing every bride when she marries the Tsar. I don't think that's the gold toilet, although I understood there was one at Blenheim that was stolen. I heard about that recently. A loo made of gold. That afternoon they visited churches, starting with... what am I doing here? Turn the page. The Temple of Resurrection, built over the spot where Alexander II was killed. Most ornamental outside, colours light green, blue, white and yellow. Inside, everything is mosaic work, light blue predominating. Many Madonnas clothed in pearls. Church of the Kazan, or Kazan. Eye of God over door to Holy of Holies. Emperor goes here to be blessed, always before leaving St. Petersburg and on returning. Masses of jewels, gold, silver and bronze. That seems a common theme. Cathedral of St. Isaac, solid granite and marble, settling evenly. 150, ? Huge red granite columns outside. Wow, that's a lot. Inside, very dark. Huge figure of Christ in stained glass, made in Munich, behind the altar. Head shows above doors. Huge brilliant diamond in halo of Madonna, once stolen by priest's nephew and returned. Diamonds and precious stones beyond imagination on the images. Beautiful marble carvings and wonderful brass doors. Malachite and lapis lazuli columns. I don't know how... Did you think all this survived the revolution? This cathedral is one of the buildings that is sinking. At the end of this very busy day, Croak wrote to great-grandfather, Although we came in early this afternoon, I feel a little tired for the first time. So instead of dressing to go down to a long dinner and being tempted to sit up late afterwards, I'm having a cosy little dinner in my room. My single room is off the room of two very pleasant ladies, and we keep the door open all of the time. One is from Chicago and knows a lot of my old friends. See the story of Grace. Some of the people in the party are a little trying occasionally, but all good-natured. It is not at all cold, only a little below freezing. My room is always warm and comfortable, and I must stop and go to bed early. I always sleep late, as even at 9 o'clock it is not light. I'm so glad every time you write that Janet has been good. Well done, Grandma. I hope your arm and thumb are coming on better. Great-grandfather had broken his arm some time ago. On our New Year's Day, Croak's letter to great-grandfather says, this afternoon we spent about an hour and a half in the Gallery of Modern Russian Painters, which was very interesting. At 3 o'clock all galleries close as it is dark. When I got home, I found your 2 letters of the 30th with enclosures. One little enclosure is a present for Janet from Grace Freeman, Aunt Grace Gray, which I will keep until I get back. That reminds me that I forgot to give you one of your Christmas presents. It was the book of operas that you liked so much in English, and it is in the top drawer in the desk, way back. Probably hidden. Today, our New Year's, the proprietor gave each lady in our party a bouquet of flowers, which they say are worth their weight in gold here. As it is not the Russian New Year, it seems very thoughtful of him. I'm feeling fine today, but the weather is too warm to suit us, since we would have liked more snow. Although my fur coat was useful, I wore the fur cap only once and then suffered from the heat. This was a leisurely day, visiting the gallery Alexandria III of Modern Russian Painters, where I thought Day and Repin to be best. Going shopping with Mrs. Allen in the afternoon and walking around some of the streets in the evening. Fire towers. What does that mean? Anyway, next day, Croak says, January the 2nd, went to Gallery of Old Painters. Wonderful collection of Murillos, many Rubens, Van Dycks, Velasquez, etc., etc. Wonderful malachite, violet jasper, lapis lazuli, vases, tables, columns. Common theme, I think. To great-grandfather the following day, January the 3rd, she wrote from Moscow. We left St Petersburg last evening at 7 o'clock. I had a room in the train to myself, which was very comfortable. I bought a Russian costume in the afternoon. Ooh, did that end up? I think I've heard of that. And while the party was settling itself on the train, I dressed up in the costume and then called them to my room. Some of them didn't know me. The costume is still in the family. I thought so. We arrived in Moscow at 7:40 next morning and drove in motor buses to the Hotel Metropole. After breakfast and a little rest, we drove to the Kremlin to visit the 5 principal churches there. Moscow, or Moskva, the place by the bridge, had begun as a small settlement comprising a garrison built by a local prince in the 12th century. 100 years later, after the little fort had been burned, another prince, Daniel Nevsky, had built another fort with wooden walls on a little triangle of land between 2 rivers, the Moscow and the Neglinia. This was called the Kremlin or fort. The settlement had flourished and grown rapidly, so that in the next century, the Metropolitan, or Archbishop as we would call him, there we are confirmed, had moved the church capital thither and had ordered the building of the Cathedral of the Assumption of the Holy Virgin, the first stone building in Moscow, and hence supervised by foreign architects. Stone walls replaced the old wooden ones of the Kremlin after the latter had been burned in a fire which, later in the eventful 14th century, had destroyed all Moscow. But alas, the Russians, not being skilled in stonework, made such a bad job that during the next 100 years the walls had to be replaced by brick ones, which stand today. It was not this Cathedral of the Assumption that the little party visited first, but to take up the narrative again, the church in the woods, the first building to be built in the Kremlin, in the original part, the low vaulted ceiling gave the feeling of being in a crypt. Decoration in golden colours is very beautiful. Next, the Church of the Annunciation, where Tsars are christened and married. So badly built at the end of the 14th century that it had to be reconstructed 100 years afterwards. This was very dark and connected by a covered way with the palace. After this, the Cathedral of the Assumption, where the Tsars are crowned. Actually, they crown themselves but are anointed by the Metropolitan. The facade is of small blocks of stone, and the building was finished by Italian workmen. Cathedral of the Archangel Michael, where all Tsars up to the time of Peter the Great were buried. All heard Vespers here on Christmas Eve, January the 6th. Music, incense, lighting of candelabra by strings, and finally the convent and church. This church had a tower and wonderful sweet bells. Beggars and pilgrims. Oh, they must have been there. The reference to 5 churches in the Kremlin is not at all clear, but there is a belfry built by Boris Godunov to give work to those who had been stricken by the terrible famine of 1601. Perhaps this is Croak's tower and wonderfully sweet bells. So that last bit's written by Grandma in her notes. Back to Croak. On Saturday, the 4th of January, we visited the palace in the Kremlin. Going through the palaces here and in other countries, there's 2 different things. Where things are gilded in other palaces and churches, they are real bronze, gold, or silver here. And precious stones are positively common. I never saw such diamonds as women wear here, or as they have in churches. The palace stands on the site where the residence of the Grand Duke stood since earliest times. It was of wood until the 16th century, when an Italian architect designed a stone one, but in the Byzantine style. There had been many additions through the years, always in the Russian style, until Peter the Great let it decay. Napoleon burned most of what was left, and a new palace was built in the middle of the last century. That was Grandma's notes. But back to Croak again. In the old palace are the gold council room, where the room where the Tsar dines, served by nobles and having a gallery for the women, the old chapel, the harem, etc. In the new palace are St George's room, where the coronation takes place, and the St Andrew's room, where the dancing is held afterwards, the royal visitors' apartments, the Queen Mother's throne and chapel. And then Grandma adds, the coronation actually takes place in the Cathedral of the Assumption, or possibly this is the anointing, the coronation being done in St George's room. This room was draped in the colours of the ribbon of the Orders of St George, somewhat similar to the VC. Oh, I've got to stop. So, take 2. That was Anthony on the telephone here, so I had a nice chat with him. So, back to this. So, I think I finished with the coronation actually takes place in the Cathedral of the Assumption, or possibly this is the anointing, the coronation being done in St George's room. This room was draped in the colours of the ribbon of the Order of St George, somewhat similar to the VC, Victoria Cross, maybe, with the knights' names on slabs around the walls. St Andrew's room is draped in light blue, the colour of that order. Croak made no mention of the famous Granovitia Hall, where in those days, in state occasions, was displayed the collection of silver acquired by the Tsars over the centuries. It was reputed to contain a collection of English silver finer than any in England. From this hall to the Cathedral of the Assumption led the staircase, which had been the scene of many assassinations. That word again, that Granovitia Hall was noteworthy also for the fact that it was overlooked by a window in the women's quarters above it to enable them to observe various functions taking place below without being seen. The Russians for a long time treated women after the Eastern fashion, keeping them apart as in a harem. And back to Croak. The same morning we visited the Romanov house where Mishalov was born. And Grandma writes, Mishalov seems to have been a kind of pet name or term of endearment for the first Romanov Tsar. The Romanov family had been among the boyars or nobles who, in the 17th century had revolted against the Polish infiltration and control of the government. The boyars had elected Michael Romanov, boy 16, to be Tsar. His father became Patriarch of the Russian Church. And Croak again. We saw the nursery with his cradle, his toys, icons, etc., etc. Beautiful drawing room upstairs reminds one of descriptions of old Venetian houses. Chapel, room upstairs with bed, slippers, gloves, and portrait of his father and mother. House was so built about that it was lost sight of but restored. Good example of Russian architecture. This afternoon was no programme, so Mrs. Allen, another lady, and I went to a bazaar and bought some linen and came back to the hotel and had tea. Next day, the 5th, we visited the rag market or peasants' bazaar, where they sell everything: clothing, furniture, paper, flowers, nuts, etc., etc. That night we went to the Imperial Opera House to see the ballet, The Magic Horse. The house is all red and gold and huge. The 5 balconies and the tier of boxes just above the parquet look like six balconies in all. The weather is still warm. Croak goes on. My fur coat has been useful, but not the fur cap. I wore it once in St Petersburg and suffered from the heat. What I needed most was my ordinary rubbers, which I left behind. Don't know what rubbers are. Trams, drosky's, eating, and nearly everything seems to stop here on Christmas, so I don't know whether you will get my letters regularly after this or not. The 6th of January was Christmas Eve. We went the morning driving around Moscow in drosky's. These cabs, rather like Victoria's, apart from trams, are the common form of transport in the cities. They go very fast and the drivers look tall and handsome in their padded and belted coats. The various quarters of the city line concentric circles around the Kremlin. We saw Red Square, the Gate of Resurrection, museums, the university, hospitals, the exposition building, and various churches, of which there are over 400 in Moscow. In the 17th century, there were over 900. Wow, it's like Ireland. The city was celebrating the 100th anniversary of the deliverance from Napoleon, so everything was usually gay, and many buildings were decorated. The large grey crows one sees everywhere are called Napoleon's scavengers. The shop seems much finer, in appearance at least, than in St. Petersburg, and the shop signs have pictures instead of words. We went to the craziest church I ever saw, St. Basil's. We know about that. Built by Ivan the Terrible. It is seldom used because it is so impossible. Under a central dome is a central chapel, while smaller chapels are under smaller domes. An ambulatory runs all around. The colouring inside and outside is grotesque. I guess Croak didn't like it. This church is considered by most people to be very fine. Oh, this is Grandma speaking again. With its cluster of Russian-looking domes, it must certainly be one of the most striking features of Red Square and of Moscow. Ivan the Terrible, having finally finished off the Tartars, built a stone church and 7 wooden ones to commemorate the victory, one church named for each of the saints on whose days he had won battles. But he was not pleased with his churches and called the best Russian architects, who removed the 8 churches, replacing them by one large one, surrounded by 8 small ones, all being joined by an ambulatory. Then Croak goes on. At 6 o'clock we went to the Church of the Archangel Michael in the Kremlin for Christmas Eve Vespers. It was very beautiful, especially the singing. After dinner there were a few minutes' talk on Russian music. Since the Russians fast from 5 o'clock on Christmas Eve until the evening of Christmas Day, the hotel restaurant was closed and our meals were served in a private room on the second, or first to us, floor. On Christmas Day, Croak wrote to Grandfather Wiles, "We had a wonderful morning. Left hotel at 8 o'clock and walked to St. Saviour's Church for the 3-hour Christmas service at which the Metropolitan presided. This church, which Croak also refers to as a cathedral, was built by the Tsars with their private money as a thanks offering for Napoleon's defeat." And Croak goes on, "I can't describe the service now, as it was most elaborate. The Russians have the most remarkable voices. Caruso doesn't compare with one of the priests we heard read and intone this morning." And in her notes she goes on to say, "Wonderful music. Few chords and different rhymes. Gorgeous robes of priests. Choir wear long, dark blue robes with red velvet sleeves and gold braid trimming. Choir master wore evening dress. Many officers and 8 or 9 women in white. The Metropolitan came in purple robe, over which long, light blue robe was put. White veil or cap. Later, blue and purple both taken off. Underneath was a plain lavender robe. Over this was put white satin robe, and then red velvet one, heavy with gold embroidery. Gold mitre, 2 candlesticks of 3 candles each, merging into one at top. Crowds of people. We were in the gallery of the North Transept. Service went from 9:30 to 12:30. 3 hours. Anyway, further on, that evening Croak wrote to great-grandfather, "This afternoon I have been lying down and packing. Now I must dress for dinner. After dinner, Dr. Allen is to give a short lecture. We go to the picture gallery tomorrow morning and leave on the 2 p.m. train for Warsaw. So as I sleep late in the mornings, I have my luggage all ready for tonight." And in the previous letter, Croak, she had said, "We leave Wednesday afternoon for Warsaw, and I gave you no address there, I believe, as we stop only 26 hours. We are due in Berlin Saturday morning, the 11th, at 6:29, so I shall be getting down to the house about the time you get up. It is now 9:30, so I'm off to bed. Tell Janet to try hard to do what she knows Mother likes, and that will make us both happy." And then Grandma finishes this chapter by saying, "Great-grandfather and Grandma were both at the station to meet Croak. Grandma remembers the excitement of getting up early to do this. It was very dark." There, that was a long one, and lots of notes and things, so I hope it made some sense to you. I enjoyed reading it, although I'm sorry about some of my pronunciation. Again, I need Claire. Okay, lots of love from us here. Bye-bye now. Bye-bye.